The room was silent, except for the soft clicking of her phone screen. The middle-aged woman sat curled up on the couch, scrolling through social media, her eyes glued to the bright screen. It was her escape, the one place where the world outside didn't matter. Her husband was at work, and the house felt empty. She preferred it that way. She didn't have to deal with the mess of the outside world, and her only connection to it was through her phone. But something was off today. She felt sick, like the flu was creeping up on her. Her throat was sore, her head throbbed, and there was a persistent cough. She had the sniffles, and a spot had appeared on her right hand. She scratched at it absently as she browsed through posts. On one of the sites she frequently visited, she noticed something odd. Posts about a strange object in the sky. It seemed ridiculous. Just rumors, nothing more, but the pictures were so vivid. The sky was changing, the object growing bigger. At first, she dismissed it. After all, these kinds of things were normal in the vast ocean of the internet. But the itch on her hand drove her crazy. She couldn't stop scratching it, and as she looked around the room, everything felt wrong. The knocking sound. Was it just the flu, or was it something else? She glanced at the table near her favorite couch and realized she had left the flu medicine there. Maybe that's what the noise was. Suddenly, there was another knock. This one was louder, more insistent. Her gaze shifted to the door. The knocking grew louder, filling her mind with dread. And then she heard a voice, familiar, friendly, yet insufferable. Her neighbor. The woman was always so friendly, always too eager to help, to offer things. But today, it felt different. Today, that voice had an edge. "I brought you some chicken soup," her neighbor called from the other side of the door. She peered through the peephole, and what she saw nearly made her gasp. The neighbor's face, sagging, her skin hanging loosely from her bones. Her features looked like they were melting. The woman recoiled, feeling a twinge of fear creep into her chest. "Go away," she called through the door, voice trembling. "What I have is contagious." She heard the neighbor's voice grow more frantic, pleading for her to let her in, but the woman refused, keeping the door firmly shut. She wanted nothing to do with the soup, no matter how kind it seemed. There was something wrong with it, the reddish color. It disgusted her. The neighbor placed the bowl of soup on the doorstep and left. The woman stood there for a long moment staring at it. She thought about leaving it there, but then the memories of her husband scolding her for being overly cautious flooded her thoughts. She couldn't leave it. Her fear of germs got the best of her, and she grabbed gloves and a mask before hastily collecting the bowl. She quickly closed the door behind her, leaving the strange soup in the fridge. But something was wrong. She couldn't bring herself to open it. She didn't know why, but she felt an unexplainable dread filling her chest. And then her phone vibrated. The absence of a ringtone unsettled her. The silence made her feel even more isolated. She focused on her phone, trying to distract herself. But that's when the knocking started again. This time, it came from two places. She was too engrossed in her phone to care. The posts about the strange object in the sky were fading into the background. She scrolled past them, her attention shifting to something else. A thread about the soil changing color, reddish roots appearing in gardens, darkening soil. The recurring theme was an iron smell emanating from the earth. Her nose was clogged from the cold, and she didn't mind it. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a blue spot. But she didn't think much of it. The cold had her in its grip. A message popped up on her phone. Her husband wouldn't be home for a while. He was B5-ing medicine for a rash he'd gotten. She couldn't help but think, maybe he doesn't bathe enough. But she pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. She was glad they slept in separate beds. The distance felt safer. The knocking persisted, growing louder and more urgent. A familiar voice echoed in her mind. Her mother's voice. "You can't live like this." The sound of sobbing filled the room, but when she listened closely, she realized it sounded just like her mother, even though she had been gone for years. But she couldn't think about that now. She didn't have the strength. She stood up, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her. As she turned to reach for the TV remote, her arms felt stuck to the plastic-covered couch. Sweat dripped down her face. The fever was taking hold. She was burning up, but as she reached to turn on the TV, the knocking came again. This time, from the fridge. She froze. A cold, sinking feeling gripped her chest. She placed her hand on the fridge door. But just as she was about to open it, she heard loud banging on the door. It was frantic, almost violent. Was it her neighbor again? She couldn't tell. But the voice that followed was slurred, pleading. "Let me in. I have to make dinner." It was her neighbor, but something was wrong with her voice. It wasn't right. She moved toward the door. As she got closer, the sound of her mother's voice echoed through her mind once more. "I miss you," her mother said, though the words made no sense. Her skin itched uncontrollably. Her whole body felt trapped, as though something was closing in on her. She was back in the days when she had gotten sick as a child, a rash all over her body. It was a foolish thing to think about now, but the memories crept up like an infection. Her phone started ringing. It could be her husband. The hope made her feel desperate. But before she could even reach for the phone, a voice broke through the chaos. Her husband's voice, slurred, distorted. "Please, let me in. It itches. I brought you that drink you like." Her mind, already on the edge, teetered dangerously close to the edge of breaking. She stood, eyes wide, as she heard him begging to come in. Desperate. The tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to the door. She couldn't resist anymore. She needed him. She needed the comfort, the familiarity of the man she loved. Her hand moved to unlock the door. There were locks, multiple locks, top to bottom, but she started undoing them, one by one. Her husband's voice grew louder, more desperate. The neighbor, too, was still pleading. They both begged her, but her gaze didn't even leave the door. Her vision blurred with the light in her eye, her hand trembling. She opened the door, and then, with a loud pop, the silence was shattered. "Step away from the door." The voice was sharp, commanding. The woman froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't move. The memories flooded back, the life she could have had, the children she would never have. Her regrets about the things left unsaid, the intimacy she had never experienced with her husband. But all thoughts ceased when she felt the warm, sticky sensation of blood touching her foot. Her gaze dropped to the floor, where blood pooled in front of her. And then, the door creaked open, revealing the twisted, melted forms of her husband and the neighbor. Their bodies were fused together, their skin dripping, their faces unrecognizable. She stepped forward, reaching for her husband's hand, her heart full of grief. But as she touched the bodies, they began to burn. The smell of burning flesh filled her nose, the sound of cracking and sizzling overwhelming her senses. She couldn't move. Her legs were frozen in place, her body refusing to obey. The bodies before her were fused to the floor. She looked up in a daze, hearing a cold, radio-like voice saying, Containment in process. The sound of boots echoed through the room, and the woman finally snapped out of her stupor. She looked down at her hands. Her own flesh was melting, warping into something grotesque, a mass of twisted tissue. Her body was no longer hers, no longer human. Men in hazmat suits filled the doorway. Their tanks hissed, the sound low and mechanical. One of them spoke into a radio, his voice devoid of emotion. Negative. She is too far gone. She could feel the liquid inside the tank moving, the cold fluid sloshing. Looking up, she saw her distorted reflection in the shiny visor of one of the suits. Her face was twisted, unrecognizable, just like the rest of her body. The suit's occupant paid her no mind, continuing his work as if she were nothing but a statistic. And then, the fire came. It roared to life, engulfing her. The fever that had gripped her body was gone, leaving nothing but cold emptiness. For a brief moment, as the fire consumed her, she saw them, her children, her husband, the life she could have had, what might have been. And then, all was black.